The moment the Roman sword was placed on the counter inside Rick Harrison's shop, something about the room changed. At first, it looked like just another ancient weapon brought in by someone hoping to turn history into cash. But then the conversation turned to its alleged value, and the number being discussed was so enormous that even the people behind the counter struggled to process it. $2 billion. Not 2,000. Not 2 million. 2 billion. And according to the story surrounding this mysterious sword, Rick Harrison eventually walked away from his own shop rather than continue the conversation. But there was one problem. A sword doesn't become worth $2 billion simply because someone says it is. And hidden beneath the sensational claim was a far more complicated question. What exactly was this object? Where did it come from? And could there possibly be a reason someone would put a value that high on a piece of Roman history? For years, Pawn Stars has built its reputation on one simple idea. Anybody can walk through those doors carrying something that looks worthless and leave with a fortune. Rick has seen everything from rare coins and weapons to historical artifacts and celebrity memorabilia. But ancient Roman objects are different. Their value isn't determined only by how old they are. Provenance, authenticity, condition, rarity, historical importance, legal ownership, and documented history can completely change the equation. A rusty-looking blade could be nearly worthless, while another object that appears almost identical could belong in a museum. And that distinction becomes especially important when the object being discussed is supposedly connected to Roman gladiators. The gladiators of ancient Rome weren't simply fictional warriors swinging swords inside an arena. They were real people who fought in front of enormous crowds, often under brutal and carefully controlled conditions. Their weapons were designed for specific fighting styles, and the equipment associated with them has become some of the most recognizable imagery from the ancient world. A genuine weapon with a documented connection to a famous gladiator, arena, military campaign, or archaeological discovery could be extraordinarily significant. But there is a massive difference between something being historically important and something being worth billions. That difference is exactly where this story begins. Imagine the scene. The shop is operating normally. Customers are moving around, deals are being negotiated, and Rick is doing what he has done countless times before, examining an object while trying to figure out what the seller knows that he doesn't. Then the sword appears. Its shape immediately suggests antiquity. The metal shows signs of age. The seller has a story. And somewhere during the conversation, the number attached to the sword begins climbing far beyond anything normally heard inside the gold and silver pawn shop. At that point, Rick would have had to ask the question that every experienced pawn dealer eventually learns to ask: how do you know? Because the seller's confidence means nothing without evidence. An ancient sword can carry an incredible story. But stories can be manufactured. Legends can grow around artifacts. And sometimes the most dangerous thing about an ancient object isn't the blade itself. It's the story attached to it. There was another reason the alleged valuation was so shocking. If an artifact were genuinely unique and historically priceless, determining its value wouldn't be as simple as searching for another sword online and comparing prices. Experts would need to establish authenticity, provenance, archaeological context, ownership history, and potentially whether the object could legally be sold at all. Ancient artifacts can involve international laws, cultural property restrictions, museum claims, excavation records, and questions about how the object originally left its country of origin. So when a seller supposedly walks into a pawn shop with an object described as a $2 billion Roman gladiator sword, the real mystery isn't simply whether Rick believed the number. The real mystery is what happened when the experts started looking beyond the blade. Because if even part of the story was true, this wasn't just another pawn shop negotiation. It was a collision between ancient history, modern money, and a valuation so enormous that one wrong assumption could turn the entire deal into a disaster. And then came the moment that supposedly made Rick walk away. But before anyone could understand why he left, they had to understand what made the sword so extraordinary in the first place. Because the closer they looked, the less this looked like an ordinary ancient weapon, and the more complicated the truth became. The story becomes even more unbelievable when you consider what made a Roman sword valuable in the first place. For Rick Harrison, age alone was never enough. A weapon could be hundreds or even thousands of years old and still have little commercial value if its history couldn't be established. But if the sword could be connected to a specific period, a documented archaeological site, or an important historical figure, everything could change. And that was the possibility hanging over this particular blade. The seller wasn't presenting it as an ordinary piece of ancient metal. The claim was that this sword carried a connection to the world of Roman gladiators, a world where weapons weren't merely tools of combat. They were symbols of status, survival, spectacle, and death. The Romans turned gladiatorial combat into one of the greatest spectacles of the ancient world. Massive amphitheaters could hold tens of thousands of spectators, and the men fighting inside them became recognizable figures in Roman society. Some were enslaved, some were prisoners, and others voluntarily entered the profession in search of money, fame, or a better life. Their weapons varied depending on their fighting style. A gladiator might carry a short sword, a curved blade, a large shield, or specialized equipment designed to create a particular matchup inside the arena. Every piece of equipment had a purpose, and that meant identifying an ancient sword wasn't simply about looking at the shape of the blade. Experts would want to know where it was discovered, what material it was made from, how it had aged, and whether its construction matched the technology of the period it was supposedly from. Even tiny details could matter. The shape of the hilt, the method used to attach the handle, the composition of the metal, and traces of manufacturing could all provide clues. An object that looked Roman could actually be a much later reproduction. And a reproduction made 100 years ago could itself become collectible, but it wouldn't carry the same historical significance as an authentic Roman weapon. This is where Rick's reputation became important. He wasn't an archaeologist, and he wasn't supposed to make a billion-dollar decision based on instinct. His job was to recognize when something might be valuable, and then bring in specialists who could determine what he was actually looking at. That's one of the most important parts of the Pawn Stars formula. Rick doesn't have to know everything. He has to know when he doesn't know enough. And this sword supposedly triggered exactly that reaction. The seller's confidence was part of what made the situation so strange. People who bring expensive items into the shop usually have some idea of what they want. But when the number reaches hundreds of millions, or even billions, the negotiation stops being normal. At that level, the question isn't simply, how much will Rick pay? It becomes, who in the world could actually buy this? A private collector? A billionaire? A government? A museum? And perhaps most importantly, would the object even be legally transferable? Those questions would become impossible to ignore if the sword really had archaeological significance. There was also the issue of provenance. Provenance is essentially the documented history of an object, where it came from, who owned it, where it was stored, and how it moved from one owner to another. For an ancient artifact, provenance can be more important than appearance. A sword with perfect documentation can be far more credible than a visually spectacular artifact with no history at all. Without documentation, even a genuine ancient object can become extremely difficult to sell legitimately. And that's where the seller's story supposedly began to encounter resistance. The more questions were asked, the more important the missing details became. If the sword was really worth $2 billion, there should have been extraordinary evidence behind that claim. A professional appraisal, archaeological documentation, a chain of ownership, scientific testing, historical records, something that could justify a valuation that exceeded the price of many famous artworks, luxury properties, and even entire companies. Instead, the sword was sitting inside a pawn shop. That contradiction was impossible to ignore. Rick had seen people enter the shop believing they possessed treasures only to discover that their prized possessions were worth a fraction of what they imagined. Sometimes the disappointment was harmless. Other times, it revealed something much more complicated. The difference between a priceless artifact and an expensive fake can come down to details that the average person would never notice. And according to the story surrounding this sword, those details were about to become the center of the entire confrontation. Because once the possibility of a $2 billion valuation entered the room, everyone suddenly had something to prove. The seller needed to prove the sword was extraordinary. Rick needed to determine whether the claim was credible. And the experts needed to answer the question nobody wanted to hear out loud. What if the sword wasn't what the seller said it was? At first, the warning signs were subtle. Nothing dramatic happened immediately. There was no obvious crack in the blade or ridiculous engraving that instantly exposed it as fake. Instead, the uncertainty came from something much more dangerous, The story surrounding the object was growing faster than the evidence supporting it. And Rick knew exactly what that meant. Because in the pawn business, the biggest red flag isn't always a fake object. Sometimes it's a real object surrounded by a fake story. The sword could still have been ancient. It could still have been valuable. It could even have been connected to the Roman world in some way. But that didn't automatically make it a gladiator's weapon, and it certainly didn't automatically make it worth $2 billion. Then the experts began asking questions about the sword that the seller apparently hadn't expected. And when the answers started coming back, Rick was forced to consider a possibility that could destroy the entire deal before it ever had a chance to begin. Because the real danger wasn't that the sword was worthless. It was that it might be valuable enough to create a completely different kind of problem. The first problem was the sword's identity. Roman weapons came in many forms, and not every ancient Roman sword was a gladiator weapon. Some were military weapons. Others could have been ceremonial. Some may have changed hands repeatedly over centuries. Without archaeological context, identifying the original purpose of a blade could be extremely difficult. The sword might genuinely date from the Roman period and still have nothing to do with an arena. That single distinction could completely change its historical significance. Then came the question of provenance. Where exactly had the sword been found? Who discovered it? When did that happen? Was there a documented excavation? Were there photographs, museum records, ownership documents, or scientific reports? Every unanswered question weakened the seller's position. And as Rick knew, a dramatic story without documentation wasn't enough to justify a dramatic price. But then something reportedly emerged that made the situation even stranger. The seller insisted that the sword was not merely ancient. The claim was that it was extraordinarily rare and connected to a specific gladiatorial history. If that could be established, the sword would theoretically become much more important than an ordinary Roman blade. But there was a problem with the way the claim was being presented. The alleged value seemed to be built on the story first and the evidence second. That is exactly the kind of situation experienced dealers become nervous about. Because once a seller names an enormous price, every subsequent piece of information can become psychologically influenced by that number. A person sees a $2 billion valuation and starts looking for evidence that supports it. But experts have to work in the opposite direction. They have to begin with the object, establish what it is, determine what can be proven, and only then discuss value. And the more the sword was examined, the harder it became to connect those dots. The supposed $2 billion figure was especially problematic. There is no universal price tag for an artifact simply because it is ancient. The most important archaeological objects may be considered effectively priceless from a cultural perspective, while having little or no legitimate private market value. Museums don't necessarily determine worth in the same way that auction houses do. Governments may restrict ownership or export. Archaeologists may argue that an artifact's greatest value comes from the information it provides about the past, not the amount of money someone is willing to pay for it. That meant the phrase $2 billion could sound impressive while actually telling Rick very little. And then came the question that changed everything. Why was the sword in a pawn shop? If someone genuinely believed they possessed a uniquely important ancient artifact worth billions, why would they bring it to a Las Vegas pawn store? Why not approach a major auction house, a museum, an archaeological institution, or a specialist in antiquities? Why expose an allegedly priceless historical object to the uncertainty of a pawn negotiation? There could have been an innocent explanation. Perhaps the owner needed immediate money. Perhaps they didn't understand the market. Perhaps they simply believed Rick could give them a fair assessment. But there was another possibility, and it was one Rick couldn't ignore. Maybe the seller didn't actually understand what they had. Or maybe they understood it perfectly. The distinction was becoming uncomfortable. Rick's role in a situation like this wasn't to get emotionally attached to the story. It was to protect the business. A pawn shop survives by controlling risk. If an item is authentic, legally owned, properly documented, and valuable, it can become an opportunity. But if even one of those elements is missing, the same object can become a liability. An ancient artifact with questionable provenance could attract unwanted attention. A stolen object could create legal consequences. An illegally exported artifact could trigger international disputes. And an artifact falsely represented as something it wasn't could become a financial disaster. So Rick needed answers before he could even think about a price. But the seller wanted to talk about the number, and that created the confrontation. The conversation reportedly became increasingly tense as the enormous valuation was brought back into the discussion. The seller believed the sword belonged in a completely different financial category. Rick, however, was looking at the evidence in front of him, and those two perspectives couldn't have been further apart. For the seller, the sword was a fortune. For Rick, it was an unanswered question. And then the conversation reached the point where the sword's alleged history became more important than its metal. If the blade had truly been connected to a famous gladiator, there should have been a trail of evidence. But ancient history rarely provides the kind of perfect documentation modern collectors expect. Thousands of years can erase names, ownership records, and exact circumstances. Even objects recovered from legitimate archaeological sites may not have a known individual owner. That created a devastating problem for the billion-dollar claim. How do you prove that a particular sword was held by a particular gladiator 2,000 years ago? You can't simply point to the blade and say, this belonged to him. There would need to be extraordinary evidence. And without it, the sword might be ancient, but anonymous. That was the moment the seller's argument began to collapse under its own weight. The more extraordinary the claim became, the more extraordinary the evidence needed to be. But the evidence wasn't growing at the same speed as the story. Rick could feel the deal slipping away. Then came the final warning. Someone raised an issue that had nothing to do with how sharp the blade was, how old it looked, or how much the seller wanted for it. It had to do with whether the sword could legally be sold at all. And suddenly, the $2 billion question wasn't what is this sword worth? It was something far more dangerous. Who actually has the right to own it? That was when Rick reportedly reached his limit. Because if the sword was potentially an archaeological artifact with questionable ownership history, there was no price worth risking the shop over. The deal could be worth millions, billions, or nothing at all. If the legal foundation wasn't solid, walking away could be the smartest move he could make. But what happened next made the situation even more dramatic. Rick didn't simply reject the price. According to the story, he walked away from the entire conversation. And when he did, the room was left with one question that nobody could answer. Was Rick walking away from a priceless Roman treasure? Or was he walking away from one of the biggest claims ever brought into the shop? Rick's decision to walk away wasn't really about whether the sword looked impressive. It was about the difference between an object having a fascinating past and having a provable, legally defensible history. In the world of ancient artifacts, that difference can be enormous. A sword can survive for nearly 2,000 years and still have no reliable record connecting it to the person who supposedly carried it. And if that connection can't be established, the dramatic story attached to the blade may be worth far less than the seller believes. The alleged $2 billion valuation also needed to be put into perspective. A number that large sounds definitive, but an appraisal isn't a magic declaration of value. The actual market for an artifact depends on who is legally able to own it, who is willing to buy it, whether it can be transported across borders, whether museums or governments have claims over it, and whether the provenance is strong enough to survive professional scrutiny. A seller can ask $2 billion for a sword, but that doesn't mean someone will pay $2 billion for it. And this is where the legend surrounding the sword becomes more complicated than the headline suggests. There is no credible basis for assuming that an ordinary Roman gladiator sword would automatically be worth $2 billion. Even an extremely rare ancient weapon would require extraordinary provenance and historical significance to approach anything remotely like that. The enormous number is therefore better understood as part of the sensational story surrounding the object rather than an established market price. That doesn't mean the sword would necessarily be worthless. Far from it. A genuine Roman-era sword could still be an important archaeological artifact. Its craftsmanship could reveal information about ancient metallurgy. Its design could help historians understand military or gladiatorial equipment. Its condition could preserve details that normally disappear after centuries of corrosion. And if its archaeological context were properly documented, it could potentially become an important object for scholars or museums. But historical importance and private monetary value are not the same thing. That distinction is exactly why Rick's reaction makes sense even without accepting every dramatic detail of the story. If an object comes with a gigantic claim but insufficient documentation, The responsible move isn't to gamble millions because the story sounds exciting. The responsible move is to stop. And that's what makes the alleged walkout so interesting. Rick Harrison built his reputation around negotiating. He is known for examining an object, bringing in an expert when necessary, calculating risk, and trying to make a deal that works for the shop. Walking away is part of that business model. Sometimes the smartest negotiation is refusing to negotiate at all. The sod represented the ultimate test of that philosophy. If the seller was right, Rick might have been standing inches away from an extraordinary piece of ancient history. If the seller was wrong, the shop could have been dragged into a nightmare involving authenticity, ownership, and legal questions. There was no easy middle ground. And the emotional impact of that realization would have been enormous. Imagine believing you have just brought in a $2 billion treasure, only to hear the person behind the counter questioning whether the basic story can be proven. The seller's excitement could quickly turn into frustration. Rick's skepticism could look like disrespect. And once money enters the conversation, even historical questions can become personal. But Rick had another reason to remain cautious. Pawn shops operate on immediate transactions. Ancient artifacts often require the opposite. They require time. Experts may need to inspect the object. Laboratories may need to conduct tests. Historians may need to investigate records. Legal specialists may need to determine whether ownership and transfer are permitted. Museums may need to be contacted. Every answer can create another question. A legitimate billion-dollar artifact wouldn't be something Rick should casually put behind the counter and wait for a buyer. It would require a completely different process. And that may explain why the dramatic walkout has become such a powerful part of the story. The image of Rick leaving his own shop makes the situation sound like a confrontation over an impossible treasure. But beneath that image is a more practical lesson. Sometimes the risk attached to an object is greater than its potential profit. The most important question wasn't whether Rick wanted the sword. It was whether Rick could safely own it. Those are two very different things. If the sword had been recovered from an archaeological site without authorization, for example, its ownership history could become a serious problem. If it had crossed international borders illegally, selling it could create another layer of complications. If it had been stolen from a private collection or museum, the entire transaction could collapse immediately. And if it turned out to be a modern reproduction, the $2 billion claim would disappear entirely. That is why experts treat provenance so seriously. Without provenance, the seller's story becomes difficult to verify. And when the story is extraordinary, skepticism becomes unavoidable. Eventually, the emotional confrontation gives way to the uncomfortable reality that there may never have been a legitimate $2 billion deal waiting inside the shop. The sword may have been old. It may have been Roman. It may even have been connected to the broader world of gladiatorial combat. But none of those facts automatically create a $2 billion price tag. And that is the final twist. The most shocking part of the story may not be that Rick walked away from a fortune. It may be that walking away was exactly what an experienced dealer should have done. Because if a seller walks into a pawn shop claiming to possess a sword worth $2 billion, the burden isn't on Rick to prove them wrong. The burden is on the seller to prove themselves right. And until that proof exists, the most valuable thing Rick can protect isn't the sword. It's his own reputation. The story also reveals why sensational artifact claims are so powerful. Ancient history creates an emotional reaction that ordinary collectibles can't. People want to believe that an object sitting in front of them once belonged to a gladiator who fought beneath the roar of tens of thousands of Roman spectators. They want to believe that a forgotten treasure survived centuries and somehow ended up on an ordinary pawn shop counter in Las Vegas. It's an incredible story. But history demands more than an incredible story. It demands evidence. And without that evidence, the legendary $2 billion valuation remains just that, a legend. The alleged Roman gladiator sword may have been fascinating. It may have been ancient. It may have carried genuine historical value. But the idea that Rick Harrison simply walked away from a confirmed $2 billion artifact is something that should be treated with extreme skepticism unless backed by verifiable documentation. In the end, Rick's greatest move wasn't making a massive deal. It was refusing to make one. Because sometimes the biggest victory in the pawn business isn't discovering a fortune. It's knowing when to walk away before the fortune becomes a disaster. And that is what makes this story so memorable. A mysterious sword entered the shop carrying a legendary claim. The number attached to it reached an almost unimaginable level. Questions about authenticity, provenance, ownership, and legality began to overshadow the blade itself. And eventually, the man famous for making deals decided that one particular deal simply wasn't worth the risk. The sword may have promised billions, but Rick chose certainty instead. And perhaps that was a real lesson hidden inside the story all along. When something sounds too valuable to be true, the first thing you should examine isn't the price. It's the proof. If this story shocked you, make sure to like the video. Subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable celebrity and porn star stories, and tell us in the comments. If you were Rick, would you have taken the risk on the mysterious Roman sword, or would you have walked away too?